That day in the kitchen was one of the craziest but most exciting moments of my life, thanks to my stepsister, Charlotte. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, and the house was quiet, eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. I had been home alone for most of the day, mindlessly flipping through channels on the TV, trying to pass the time. My dad and his wife, Margaret, were out for the day, running errands or doing whatever it was they did when they disappeared together. That left me and Charlotte alone in the house. Charlotte and I had never been particularly close. We were almost the same age, yet we were extreme opposites in almost every way. She was always the methodical, careful type of person, with a plan for everything. I was the laid-back sort, willing to go with the flow. Our relationship had always been friendly but distant. We lived under the same roof and exchanged polite welcomes, but that was about it. But now, something had changed. Charlotte had been looking at me strangely in recent weeks. At first, I felt I was dreaming things. Her gaze stayed on me for a second too long. She appeared to make excuses to be near me, in the same room, sitting just a bit too close. It wasn't visible and no one else would notice, but I felt it. It was faint, but it was present, and it was beginning to drive me mad. That afternoon, I sat in the kitchen, browsing through my phone while the light shone through the windows. I was trying to ignore the weird energy that seemed to linger in the air whenever Charlotte was there. I assumed she'd spent the entire day in her room. But when I heard footsteps behind me, I knew she was going to make her presence known. "Hey." Charlotte's voice shattered the stillness as she entered the kitchen. I looked up from my phone to see her standing in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. She appeared serene, but there was something in her gaze that made my heart race slightly quicker. "Hey," I said nonchalantly, trying to keep it calm. "What up?" She shrugged, continuing into the kitchen, her gaze never leaving mine. "Not much. I just felt like coming downstairs. It's rather quiet in here." I nodded and laid my phone down on the table. "Yes, it is. Margaret and Dad won't be returning for a time." Charlotte looked at the clock and then back at me, a slight grin on her lips. "I understand. That is why I came down." I felt my gut nod at her words, but I wasn't sure why. She was looking at me differently, something fun but serious. It made me feel nervous, but also curious. Charlotte walked over to the stove and grabbed a glass from the cabinet to fill with water. She moved slowly and carefully, as if she was aware I was watching her. And I was. I couldn't help it. There was something about the way she walked, how her hair flowed carelessly over her shoulders, and how her lips curled into a little knowing grin. It made it difficult to look away. "What are you doing in here all alone?" she asked, taking a sip from her glass before leaning against the counter. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just bored, I guess, killing time until they get back." She nodded, her eyes still locked on mine. "You've been acting weird lately." The comment caught me off guard, and I frowned slightly. "Weird? What do you mean?" Charlotte tilted her head, her smile widening just a fraction. "I don't know. You've been avoiding me." I blinked, surprised by her observation. I hadn't thought I was avoiding her, but maybe I had been. It wasn't intentional, but the tension between us, whatever it was, had been growing, and I didn't know how to handle it. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. She raised an eyebrow, setting her glass down on the counter. "Really? Because it feels like you are." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, I had been keeping my distance from Charlotte. I didn't know why, exactly, but it was like something had changed between us, and I didn't know how to navigate it. I didn't know if it was just me or if she felt it too. But either way, I had been trying to ignore it. "I've just been busy," I said lamely, knowing it wasn't a great excuse. Charlotte's smile broadened as she drew closer, her eyes shining with something I couldn't identify. She took a step closer, her eyes shining with something I couldn't place. "You're busy, huh? Too busy to talk to me?" Her speech had a seductive lilt to it, but behind it, I sensed something more serious. She wasn't just messing around, There was something genuine underlying her remarks, something she didn't speak out, something genuine behind her words, something she wasn't stating aloud. "I'm not avoiding you, Charlotte," I continued, but my voice was softer and hesitant. She took another step forward, bringing her body within a few feet of mine. I could feel the tension in the room increasing, thickening the air between us. My heart increased, and I swallowed hard, attempting to maintain my calm. "I believe you are," she murmured quietly, her gaze seeking mine. "But you do not have to." I blinked, surprised by her remarks. The room felt smaller now, with the distance between us decreasing with each passing second. Charlotte's presence was overpowering. Her proximity made it difficult to think clearly. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," I said, but the words seemed empty. Charlotte came forward, her face now inches from mine. I could feel the heat emanating from her flesh. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my mind was racing as I struggled to comprehend what was occurring. This was my stepsister, who I had been living with for 2 years. But just now, she didn't feel like a sister. She felt like something else. Charlotte added softly, "You don't have to pretend. I know you felt it too." As her words set in, I tensed and felt my breath seize in my throat. She was correct. I'd felt it. The tension. Our unconscious relationship had been boiling for weeks. I tried to ignore it and persuade myself it wasn't real. But now that she was so near, with her gaze fixed on there was no denying it. I began speaking, but my voice drifted off as I struggled to construct a cohesive idea. Charlotte's fingers moved and lightly brushed across my arm. The contact was light, barely there, yet it shot a bolt of electricity through me, increasing my heart rate. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, her lips twisting into a faint, knowing grin. "Simply quit pretending." Charlotte leaned in before I could react, her lips gently brushing over my cheek. The gesture was simple and seemingly innocent, yet it put every nerve in my body on fire. I stood transfixed in place, unable to move or think as the truth of what was occurring struck me. This was not only in my thoughts. This was not merely some unsaid tension, as I had believed. This was not merely some unsaid tension, as I had believed. Charlotte felt it too, and there was no turning back. I stood still as Charlotte's lips brushed across my cheek. It wasn't a complete kiss, but rather a hint of something more. However, it was enough to put my heart into overdrive. I could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin and the soft pressure of her lips in the air between us. I muttered to Charlotte, my voice barely audible. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to say. Part of me wanted to shove her away, to put a stop to this before it escalated. But another part of me, which I had been attempting to ignore, wanted her to stay close and see where this was heading. She did not move. Instead, she smiled, the same sweet, knowing look that had my heart racing. "What?" she said simply, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the tension between us was palpable now, crackling like static electricity in the air. "We can't," I said, but the words seemed hollow and empty, as if I didn't believe them myself. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was going on. This was Charlotte, my stepsister. This was wrong, right? But then she took another step closer, her body softly brushing against mine. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, and the tenderness of her touch as she reached up and softly rested her palm on my chest. My breath tightened, and I felt a surge of feeling sweep over me. Bewilderment, excitement, terror, and something else I couldn't quite define. "Who says we can't?" she said, her gaze fixed on me. Her glance conveyed a challenge, a query that hovered in the air. I gulped hard, attempting to clear my mind, but it was impossible to think clearly with her so near, her touch sending shockwaves throughout my body. "You know why?" I continued, though my voice was unsteady and uncertain. Charlotte's hand glided down my chest, her fingertips making a slow, purposeful trail that caused my heart to rush faster. "Do I?" she inquired gently, her lips curling into a mischievous smile. "Because it appears to me that you have been desiring this as much as I have." Her words struck me like a punch in the belly, and I tensed, my mind racing. Was she correct? Had I always desired this? The notion sent shivers down my spine, and I felt a rush of remorse rise within me. However, there was another factor at play, something stronger. A part of me had been yearning for this moment, desiring it without even knowing it. I began. But again my voice drifted off, unable to complete the statement. But again my voice drifted off, unable to complete the phrase. Charlotte took another step closer, her body pressed firmly against mine, and I could feel her heartbeat racing through her chest. Her gaze were intense, full of hunger and curiosity, making it difficult to look away. "You don't have to be scared," she said softly, slipping her hand up to rest on the side of my neck, her thumb delicately brushing across my jaw. "You don't need to fake anymore." I felt the ground move beneath my feet, like if the universe had tipped off its axis and I was whirling out of control. Everything about this seemed terrible, but it also felt natural, as if we had been preparing for this moment for a long time, even if none of us was prepared to accept it. "Hello, Charlotte." I attempted again, but my voice wavered. She shook her head, softly touching my lips to silence me. "It's all right," she murmured quietly, her voice calm. "You don't need to say anything." Charlotte moved in before I could stop her, her lips pushing against mine in a delicate yet intense kiss. It was mild at first, almost tentative, as if she was giving me the opportunity to back away. "Stepsister," I said weakly. Even as I stated the words, they seemed like an excuse rather than a reason. Charlotte lifted an eyebrow, and her smile returned. "So, what?" she inquired, her voice quiet yet urgent. "We are not connected by blood. We're only two people. You do not have to let that deter you." Her logic caused my mind to whirl. Technically, she was correct. We weren't blood related. We were just linked by our parents' marriage. Yet the weight of that reality hung over me like a heavy cloud. "So what about them?" "How about Dad and Margaret?" I inquired, my tone barely above a whisper. Charlotte's smile faded, and she moaned gently, pulling back just enough to create some distance between us. "I don't know," she said, her voice subdued. but I know I don't want to pretend like nothing is going on between us anymore." Her comments struck me hard, and I felt a rush of emotions build up inside me. Guilt, perplexity, and something deeper that I wasn't prepared to define. She was right. We couldn't continue to pretend. The tension between us had been building for far too long, and now that it had reached a peak, there was no turning back. But what were we to do now? "I am not sure if we can just ignore that," I replied calmly, my thoughts still racing. Charlotte nodded, her eyes softening when she glanced at me. "We don't need to sort out everything right now," she replied gently. "We can take it step by step." Her remarks provided a weird feeling of serenity to the tempest that had been brewing within me. She was right. We didn't need to know all the answers right away. We just needed to be honest with ourselves and each other about what was going on. I took a long breath, and the strain in my chest began to lessen. "Okay," I whispered gently. "One step at a time." Charlotte smiled. A true grin this time, and it made my heart swell. "We'll work it out," she said calmly. "Together." And at that moment, I believed her. However, the story was far from done. The days after that incident in the kitchen passed in a blur, and the tension between Charlotte and myself only seemed to worsen. It wasn't simply the recollection of the kiss, or the way her touch made my nerves burn. It was the fact that we both knew we had passed a boundary we could never get back. Now, everything had changed. We attempted to go about our days as usual, as if nothing had occurred, but this was impossible. Every time we were in the same room, the air seemed electrified with an unsaid electric energy. Every gaze, every unintentional touch drove my heart pounding, and Charlotte's eyes showed the same intensity. It was as if a magnet was dragging us together, despite the fact that we both knew it was hazardous. About a week after that incident in the kitchen, I found myself sitting on the couch in the living room, trying to concentrate on the television, but my thoughts kept straying. I could hear Charlotte moving around the kitchen, plates clinking and cupboards shutting as she cleaned up after supper. My father and Margaret were gone again, perhaps to a dinner party, leaving the home alone save for the two of us. The place was too quiet, too empty, and my thoughts were more active than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about Charlotte, the way she looked at me, the way her lips felt on mine, and how her touch lasted long after she'd moved away. Every minute alone with her was fraught with anxiety, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense it grew. Just as I was ready to get up and go to my room, Charlotte came at the living room doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. She said nothing at first, simply stood there for a minute, her gaze fixed on mine. The expression on her face sent shivers down my spine, and my heart quickened. "You okay?" she inquired. Her voice quiet yet tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. I nodded, but my throat felt tight, just thinking. Charlotte strolled into the room, tossed the dish towel onto a nearby chair, and sat on the edge of the couch, only a few feet from me. The air between us was thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse racing in my chest. "What about?" she inquired, her gaze probing mine. I hesitated, wondering how to respond. The fact was, I'd been thinking about her, about us, since that night in the kitchen, but I didn't know how to say it out, and I wasn't sure whether I was prepared to face the truth of what was occurring between us. "Just everything," I said finally, barely above a whisper. Charlotte nodded, but her gaze remained riveted on me. "Yes, me too." For a minute, we just sat there in quiet, the weight of all that had gone unsaid hanging heavy in the atmosphere. I could feel the magnetic force pulling us closer with each passing second. And I knew that if I didn't get up and go right now, things would escalate in ways I wasn't prepared for, but I didn't move. Instead, I felt myself leaning toward her, attracted by an unseen force that I could no longer resist. Charlotte did not draw away. She kept my look, her eyes softening, and I saw the same longing reflected in her face. She wanted it just as much as I did. See the same longing reflected in her expression. She wanted it just as much as I did. We said we'd take it slowly, I whispered, my voice trembling. Charlotte smiled. A little, knowing smile that sent my heart racing. We're taking it easy, she added quietly. However, this does not imply that we should disregard what is happening. Her words shot a shock through me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned closer, closing the gap between us. Charlotte met me halfway, her lips brushing against mine in a gentle, timid kiss, much like the first time. But this time, there was no hesitancy or remorse, just the two of us, finally succumbing to the tension that had been building for weeks. Charlotte's hand slipped up to rest on the back of my neck, bringing me closer. My heart hammered in my chest, and my skin buzzed with the intensity of the moment. Everything else seemed to drift away, leaving only her touch, her warmth, and her presence. When we eventually parted ways, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we fought to regain our breath. The world appeared to blur around us, and for a brief time, we felt like we were the only two people in the universe. We should probably stop, I whispered gently. But I didn't mean it. My hands remained on her waist, and I did not want to let go. Charlotte grinned as her fingertips lightly brushed the side of my cheek. Do you truly want to stop? I paused, my heart pounding. I do not know. I just don't want to mess things up. She sighed softly, her forehead still resting against mine. I get it. But maybe we're not messing anything up. Maybe we're just figuring things out. Her words hung in the air between us, and I couldn't help but think she was right. This didn't feel like a mistake. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like something that had been building for a long time. Something that was finally finding its way to the surface. I don't know what we're supposed to do, I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. Charlotte leaned in too. But I know, she said. And then at that moment, I couldn't hold it anymore. And she noticed. And so she kissed me. It was with passion that we both let go. It felt fantastic. I had no idea what was going on since I was so into the moment and the closeness that the kiss brought. I believe because of how eager I was. It went by quickly, but she didn't seem to mind. It felt like a release. After a minute, she shifted and stood up, saying, "We'll figure it out," before disappearing upstairs. I nodded as she approached the stairs, but I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The days that followed felt like we were living in a suspended world. Charlotte and I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Every gaze, touch, and moment bore a weight that we both felt but could not completely recognize. We never discussed what had transpired between us, but the link was always present, unmistakable and difficult to ignore. I attempted to go about my daily routine as regularly as possible, but it seemed like everything had changed, as usual as possible. Yet everything seemed to have altered. I was very aware of Charlotte's presence in the home, the sound of her footfall as she went around, and the way her gaze seemed to follow me whenever we were in the same room. It was as if the air itself had thickened, imbuing each of our interactions with an unconscious meaning. We were alone in the home one evening, approximately a week after our second kiss. My father and Margaret had gone out to supper, leaving us with a type of stillness that seemed to accentuate every idea and emotion. I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading, trying to take my mind off the tension that seemed to be mounting with each passing second. Charlotte went into the kitchen, her motions slow and deliberate, and I felt my heart race as she sat across from me. The room was poorly lit, with the only light coming from the overhead bulb over the table, forming lovely shadows on her face. She didn't say anything at first, but sat there with her gaze fixated on me and her face inscrutable. "We need to discuss," she eventually stated, her voice calm but forceful. I set down the magazine, my heart beating. I was dreading this talk, even though I knew it was unavoidable. We couldn't keep pretending that nothing was inevitable. We couldn't continue like nothing had occurred. We couldn't continue ignoring the elephant in the room. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaking. "I suppose we do." Charlotte leaned forward, hands clasped on the table in front of her. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at me, as if trying to figure out how to begin. The silence between us was heavy, almost suffocating, and I could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on me. "I don't know what to do," she said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and vulnerability. "I don't know how we're supposed to act now." I nodded, swallowing hard as I tried to find the right words. "Me neither." The truth was, I didn't have any answers. I didn't know what we were supposed to do, how we were supposed to move forward. All I knew was that our relationship had altered, and there was no going back to the way it had been before. "Do you regret it?" Charlotte questioned abruptly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her question caught me off guard, and I felt a rush of terror rise within me. Did I regret it? The kisses, the times we shared, the bond that had been growing between us for weeks? My thoughts raced as I attempted to digest her inquiry. But the answer was obvious, even if I didn't want to accept it. "No," I said gently, shaking my head. "I do not regret it." Charlotte's shoulders relaxed somewhat, and I noticed a spark of relief in her eyes. She acknowledged, softly, "Neither do I. But I am terrified." I grimaced and leaned forward. "What exactly are you scared of?" She groaned and ran her hand through her hair, attempting to gather her thoughts. "I'm afraid of what this means," she added, her voice wavering. "I'm frightened of what will happen if we keep going. I'm frightened of what will happen if we keep going. I'm frightened of what will happen if we don't." Her comments struck me hard, and I felt a knot in my throat. I understood precisely what she meant since I felt it myself. A part of me wanted to keep going, to see where our relationship might go. But a part of me felt afraid. I'm terrified of the potential implications. I'm terrified of what it would entail for our family, my father, and Margaret. "I'm not sure what the correct thing is," I acknowledged, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I do not want to lose you." Charlotte gazed up at me, her eyes full with emotion. "You won't," she added quietly, "but we need to work this out." I nodded, my heart beating against my chest. "Yes, we do." For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of the discourse hanging heavy in the air. The tension between us was still palpable and electrifying, but there was something else now, a sense of comprehension, a recognition that we couldn't carry on as we had been. We needed to make a decision. Charlotte rose up abruptly, pushed her chair back, and walked to the window. She stood there for a minute, peering out at the lowering sky, her arms crossed across her chest. I watched her, my thoughts racing, trying to figure out what to say and do. She recommended we take a break, with her back to me. "A break?" I repeated, frowning. Charlotte turned to face me with a serious gaze. "Yes, a respite from whatever this is. Give ourselves some time to think about what we actually desire." Her remarks made logic, but they also filled me with dread. My chest tightened at the prospect of taking a step back and putting some distance between us. But at the same time, I knew she was correct. We couldn't go on like this, stuck in the middle of something we didn't entirely grasp. "Maybe that's a good idea," I answered gently, though the words were heavy in my lips. Charlotte nodded, her gaze softening as she stared at me. "We don't need to make any decisions right now," she explained softly, "but we need some space to work things out." I gulped hard and nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you're correct." The room was silent again, but this time it seemed different. The tension between us had subsided significantly, replaced with a sense of clarity and understanding. We didn't know all the answers, but we'd taken the first step toward finding out. That was enough for now. Charlotte came back to the table and sat across from me again. She reached out and took my hand in hers, and the simple act sent a rush of comfort through me. Her touch felt familiar and reassuring, and I understood that no matter what occurred between us, I did not want to lose her. She was too essential for me. "We'll sort it out," she whispered quietly, stroking her thumb lightly against the back of my palm. "Take one day at a time." I nodded and squeezed her hand softly.